All right, thanks for joining in and listening to me today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I see the recovery process in baseball and how it relates to movement. As with any of my presentations, I think it's it's a good thing to put a little disclaimer up front just to say that this information is simply my current thought processes and knowledge, and theories based off of my knowledge base right now. That doesn't necessarily mean that this information is 100% correct, or it's completely infallible, or it's not subject to evolve or change in the future. So there may be pieces of the puzzle that I'm missing and I've yet to discover or unravel or understand. And I think that's speaks to the importance of looking at collecting information and understanding as a journey. So if I do have something missing, glaringly wrong, please let me know. And it's an opportunity for me to understand and learn a little bit better. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Steve Oster. I'm a chiropractor, strength conditioning coach, and co-owner of the Baseball Development Group, which is a high-performance baseball training facility in Toronto, Canada. Prior to all of this, I pitched at Cornell University, where I accumulated numerous accolades, including, I believe, an 8.5 career ERA, graduating, I think, 4th all-time wild pitches and something similar in box. Don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about pitching mechanics or competing on the mound directly, at least, and we're going to get a little bit away from that and talk a little bit more about the recovery process. So in April earlier this year, I came out with a book on recovery as it relates to baseball, along with one of my co-authors, Tyler White. It took me a couple years of researching, studying, clarifying, and condensing my own thoughts and ideas before I could finally get it out there. Obviously, launching something like a recovery guide for baseball at the end of April may not be the best strategic move from a marketing standpoint, but I still think it holds a lot of value and is applicable right now in December as we get into the off season. So my fascination, at least with the recovery process, started back in, I believe, 2015 in a blog post that I wrote where I simply just posed the question, what are we trying to recover? At the time when I was thinking about the recovery process, I couldn't really find a good answer for this, or rationale for recovery in general in the baseball world. All I saw were a bunch of videos of people doing a lot of things and not really giving too much of a specific rationale or detailed theoretical background on why we were doing these things. It eventually just started me down a path of curiosity, where I researched and studied it and asked a lot of questions regarding to the recovery process, and even looked outside of baseball. But when we look inside of baseball itself, I think we really see two ends of a spectrum when it comes to applying and understanding recovery. On the one end of the spectrum, we have coaches and players and parents who aren't even really consciously aware of the value of recovering at all. These are the people who are asking their prized arms at 13 and 14 to pitch multiple games a weekend just to win a $15 trophy that they could buy down the street. Maybe it's the athletes, the college athletes or the high school athletes who think that lifting at 5:30 a.m. is a badge of honor, and posting on Instagram with a hashtag grinding is a something to be proud of. Even worse, there are some people in this camp who think that just more work is always going to be better and breed a better outcome, which is just not true. On the other end of the spectrum, the idea has spread, at least more recently, that athletes just need to do way more recovery work. If we're going to work out 2 hours in the gym, maybe we need to spend 4 hours doing recovery. That has led to, more foam rolling after lifts, more stim unit usage, more active recovery work, more mobility circuits, more sleep, more therapy, more supplementation. The list kind of goes on and on and on. And to me, that argument falls apart a little bit when you try to consider, what you're recovering from and understanding the adaptation process, which we're not necessarily going to get into to detail today. But we should start off at least with a definition, and this comes from Mujica's Recovery for Sport textbook. That is a fantastic resource, but he defined it as the time necessary for various physiological parameters which were modified by exercise to return to resting values. Now, when you look at this, the definition seems really straightforward and really intuitive, and I definitely agree with that. The problem is that things are just a little bit more complex than that, okay? And this becomes especially true when we go from, just understanding this scholastic definition to trying to practically apply it in a real world baseball environment where things are going all over the place sometimes. And this is especially true when we talk about movement dynamics, which is even more complex. Ultimately, what we're trying to recover are certain biological disruptions. And there are a number outlined here in this reproduction of one of their charts. Where essentially, we're looking at things like heart rate and blood lactate, for example, and we're trying to restore them back to previous levels. Okay, lactate is an interesting example, as we know in the baseball world, because we've historically made pitchers do far too many things to try and remove lactic acid, which isn't necessarily even a thing. It's actually called lactate, as a means to just flush that out because it's waste and it needs to get out of there. Well, the funny thing is that lactate is typically removed within about 60 to 90 minutes. And if it's going to get removed anyways, why are we so quick to try and flush it out? This line of thinking, I think, is at least partly responsible for the explosion of stim units in recent years, which has kind of confused me, and I've written a little bit about that before. But, if you look at the research on stim units, the evidence would more likely suggest that it doesn't provide an advantage over something that's free, like active recovery. Maybe there's a potential benefit from a psychological perception of being and feeling recovered, but the same can be said about a lot of different modalities, especially ones where players think are cool and they're already psychologically bought into it. So I think that is one of those things where we need to just ask better questions and try to look into things a little bit more deeper and try to get a more theoretical rationale. I mean, one of the arguments posed for using stim units is it flushes metabolites out faster. But if we know that they're going to be out, those metabolites are, one, a signal for adaptation, which we need in the off season potentially, but two, they're going to be gone in a short period of time. Why do we need to rush to get them out? Anyways, you don't necessarily, as a coach or a player, you don't necessarily need to be measuring all these biomarkers of recovery, I don't think. We're not asking you to take blood samples of your players or muscle biopsies at regular intervals if you're an amateur or collegiate and even sometimes pro athlete. But the underlying principles of your methods should at least align with, returning these disruptions back to normal. And I think in general, we do a pretty good job of that in certain realms and with certain modalities, like understanding sleep and understanding the nutritional requirements to return back to baseline and reducing the perception of fatigue and soreness a little bit. And there are other modalities that we kind of understand and we mostly agree upon, but we still need to refine quite a bit. Icing is one of those examples where there's a movement now where icing is the devil and no one should ever ice, but we know that it slows down the recovery process and the healing process if we do ice, and there are some potential negative effects of it, but there are also some positive psychological and analgesic effects of using ice as well. So I don't think we need to necessarily throw it completely out. We need to potentially ask better questions about, what is the optimal dose for active recovery? We know that athletes respond well, to doing some light work when they're in a fatigue state or the day after, but how much do we need to do? And what are the signals for adaptation? These are just some questions that I think we're all, kind of on the same page, but we need to just refine a little bit. There are modalities and other things that we like to throw at athletes from a recovery standpoint that I don't think we necessarily fully understand or we may be misapplying altogether. Proprioception to me is a very good example of that. And if we look around the baseball world and ask players for a post-throwing routine, a lot of people will be throwing in exercises and interventions that are supposedly improving or restoring proprioception. We believe that we must do something to restore that when, in fact, if we just let fatigue subside, because that is probably more likely what's causing a reduction in proprioception from throwing is the accumulation of acute fatigue. If we let that acute fatigue kind of subside, we will see a return to normal proprioception. So we don't necessarily need to force that with exercise, with the caveat of that being that maybe it's not necessarily a restoration of proprioception, but it can be used as pushing an adaptation. But if you look at the research on trying to improve proprioception, it's kind of iffy anyways. So, why are we doing all these things after throwing if we don't necessarily think they're going to have an effect on returning to previous resting levels of proprioception, which we know they won't, and we aren't necessarily too sure that it's going to have a training effect. So, there are things like that, and manual therapy is another good example where I think a lot of people think that we can fix soft tissue and we're fixing things with our hands or with lacrosse balls, when reality it's just a very temporary effect. So there are things that we need to do a better job of trying to refine and understand. But what's the most confusing to me when we talk about recovery and modalities and intervention is, we never really see all that much information or people stressing the returning to baseline of range of motion. And not just passive range of motion like in the picture, but active and strong and controllable range of motion. And I always try to understand the mindset, and I think this is what this presentation is mostly about here. So, it's been encouraging over the last few years, at least, to see more of an emphasis on the baseball world on understanding and trying to implement a constraints-led model to movement. And same thing can be said about complexity theory and understanding motor control. And it seems like we're pushing the needle a little bit further towards understanding this incredibly complex and mysterious thing that is human behavior. We've come to appreciate that there are certain constraints on the movement system, the boundaries or limitations that, are dependent on the task and the environment and the organism, and that's going to help shape how we move. When we're trying to solve a particular movement task, that solution is going to be dependent on the current dynamic of all of these constraints, as well as our prior history of movement. And here's my hypothesis. If we're asking a pitcher to solve one of the hardest movement tasks in all sports, which I think it is, then wouldn't we want to pay closer attention to the nature of their organismic constraints? That is, if we're asking Max Scherzer to solve the task of executing a pitch 3,500 times per year, we'd want him to be well equipped to do so. We'd want to ensure high motor intelligence or robustness in solving the task itself. And we'd probably want to ensure relatively stable control parameters or constraints, or otherwise the same starting conditions if we're going to ask him to do it that many times. But in my opinion, I think the lens that we're using to attempt to understand these two problems, the robustness and these starting parameters, is a little bit foggy. When we talk about movement, at least in my opinion, we're attempting to solve the most complex thing on the planet. I think you can make a pretty good case for that. But there are a near infinite number of elements and levels and interactions and sublevels and sub-elements and influences and all these different interactions and integrations between these things, to reliably predict outcomes or control the system as a whole. Okay, if we look at Clayton Kershaw, for example, here, we could view him and how he interacts with his environment from the macro level as its own little system. I mean, we could zoom in into his shoulder and look at how muscular tissue interacts with connective tissues, and that could be its own little system. And we could zoom even further into the the extracellular matrix and how proteins between cells like integrins and dystrophins kind of interact with each other even more, and how they're their own system. I mean, there's so many different layers and levels and integrations of these own pieces of the puzzle that it's just remarkably complex. And I think when it comes to framing movement and potentially influencing it, we're often imposing a complex lens to a complex problem, which to me may be an issue. And for example, claiming a pitcher is moving the way that he is on the mound because of how they're moving at maybe 40% intensity in another drill is probably more of an argument of faith than it is fact or theory. We see stuff like this all the time where you hear a coach nowadays at least say, this player can't keep his legs straight in an active straight leg raise on my table, so you know what, he's not ready to hip hinge in his swing. And to me, that's a pretty big jump. It's connecting a lot of dots, and that's not to say necessarily that that those things cannot be true. To me, it's more of an argument that trying to solve complexity with more complexity is not the best path to do so. And in my opinion, and from what I understand from some authors who are systems thinkers, one of the best ways to actually solve complexity and interact with a complex system and try to solve for it is to break it down into simpler components and attempt to understand the relationships between them. And that means necessarily that we don't have control of an outcome. Okay, we can't look at a complex system and say, if we do this, this is necessarily what's going to happen. We have to let go of that control. Okay, so when we talk about the simplest component of movement that we can at least measure and intervene, one of the things that I look at is the joint, specifically the joint capsule itself. So the joint and the joint capsule are important, first and foremost, because it's a decent proxy for movement capacity. In other words, it really helps coaches and players answer the question, can your joints do what you're asking them to do? Okay, if we look at this example of Aroldis Chapman, and we look at his drive leg or his left leg and look at how much his femur internally rotates relative to his pelvis, or look at how much his knee rotates relative to his the backside of his belt initially, which it does a lot without the belt moving. That's just a display of femur rotating internally on the acetabulum or the pelvis. If I put someone on the table and they do not display that, can we reasonably expect them to have that sort of movement on the mound? This idea is something that I've talked about quite a bit, but it's essentially, trying to prevent coaches from banging their head against the wall, in drill work, trying to, out-cue a physical limitation. We need to have, I think, a better understanding of what the athlete can do from a movement capacity standpoint before asking them to do it. And I think this is a good place to start with the joint. Another reason that the joint is important as well, it's a tremendous source of sensory information to help the brain understand what's available, what it's capable of, its boundaries for movement, pressure information, movement information, and some of that actually directly connects straight to the brain. Okay, so that's an important thing because it's directly connecting, doesn't have to go through the spinal cord in certain instances, and if you've paid at least any attention to range of motion research in baseball, you probably know that it's really confusing. Over the last few decades, there have been a number of different studies that have shown, a wide range of findings and conclusions regarding performance and injury, and I think this is a bit misleading. So, we've seen stuff like internal rotation deficit, GERD, is definitely going to cause injury, and now that's taken back to, okay, maybe it's total range of motion, maybe actually internal rotation increases with throwing, maybe it's shoulder flexion, maybe none of this happens at all. And I think if we were going just off of what the papers say, we are probably not looking at it correctly. In theory, there's a lot of variables included in performance and injury, and range of motion changes happen way more frequently than in spring training, and then reassessing at the end of the year, or even 4 months later. So I think this is important to understand, and maybe something that we need to reframe. My goal, specifically in season, is just to maintain a normal bandwidth of movement capacity. So I don't want to gain too much range of motion, and I don't want to lose too much range of motion. We want to keep things somewhat stable and try to avoid, a too big of a range or too big of a jump, because that can lead to a massive nonlinear shift in overall movement behavior. So this is kind of speaking a little bit to maintaining those constraints and maintaining those starting conditions for our skill and for our movement. So if we spend our entire offseason, for example, working on trying to automate at least a specific pattern of movement like throwing, wouldn't we want to just keep that going during the year? We know that joint range of motion is the simplest means of identifying movement capacity, or one of the simplest means, and that movement capacity is a constraint for movement as a whole. So ideally, we want to keep an eye on this. It just makes intuitive sense. If we go even deeper and try to attempt to understand this from a dynamic systems theory perspective, which you may or may not want to do, our movement patterns are. To go a bit deeper, our movement patterns are significantly dictated by our movement history, which is really an ongoing, dynamic, and evolving process. We know that the more we practice a movement with similar constraints, the stronger that pattern will be. This is what's called deepening an attractor state. Moreover, if we spend a significant amount of time going through a movement pattern that is stable, the tissues involved will be stressed very similarly and therefore have a higher tissue resiliency for that specific pattern. If you think about going from years of back squatting and your body building up resilience to it to all of a sudden front squatting for a couple of weeks, you can imagine how sorry you're going to be after those first few lifts. Even though the movement is very similar, the specificity of loading is not really quite the same. So let's put this together with a common scenario. A pitcher begins the offseason, for example, addressing, the movement or joint limitations incurred from a long season of baseball. They spend their time restoring normal for them glenohumeral, elbow, and hip arthrokinematics or passive range of motion. They restore those qualities, and then for the rest of the offseason, they just make sure that they're maintaining that controllable range while gaining strength and hypertrophy in the gym, and then trying to place that all together on the mound for how efficient they're moving and how well they're moving. As the season progresses, the pitcher maintains the strength and power because that's what we do in baseball, and they put much less of an emphasis on maintaining controllable and strong range of motion. So, this is a very common scenario in baseball where, from a strength conditioning standpoint, we check in way more with make sure you're getting your in-season lifts and you're lifting to be strong in season. You're maintaining power, but how often are we trying to maintain strength and range of motion? And in this example, it seems like, mechanical changes are holding up for now. And unknowingly at the beginning of the year, maybe they begin to lose small amounts of shoulder internal rotation or elbow supination or lead leg internal rotation. And that stability of the movement pattern is just being tested and challenged by these altered constraints until one day, a small change in one of these ranges turns into a big change in overall movement outcome, and they start moving differently. As the task becomes more and more frequent, and the variability of which that pitcher can solve the task is diminished or lowered, the same areas keep getting loaded and loaded and loaded. The robustness of the system itself is diminished, and therefore variability in how we solve the problem decreases. So new areas of the body are now seeing acute spikes in stress and demand. They're seeing too much or too quickly of a load relative to what they're used to. A few weeks go by, and with this increased soreness comes potentially more load, and then one day it just becomes too much to bear, and the pitcher goes on the DL. So what can we do about it? The answer to this question is obviously not having a coach hire a full-time therapist or ATC to break out a goniometer daily. We need an alternative. We can't do that in most cases. We're just constrained by that, okay? So what do we need to do? My opinion, one of the best ways to solve that is to use controlled articular rotations, or CARs, from the Functional Range Systems Group. What's a CAR? Or what is CARs? CARs are essentially active rotational movements at the outer ranges of motion. Okay, so it's taking a singular joint, or in the case of the spine, multiple joints, and trying to actively move them at the outer ranges in a rotational manner. We use them for a number of different reasons. One of the biggest ones is to assess organismic constraints, and that's the topic of this lecture a little bit, but we also use them to essentially maintain joint and capsule health. So every time you go through an active full range movement, we're potentially squeezing in more nutrient into the joint. We're lighting up the brain and the motor cortex and the sensory cortex about having that range of motion. And, we're potentially also helping direct tissue healing and, getting the body to align collagen fibers the way that we'd want them to. Finally, we use it as a training tool and integrating, some of the CARs into our actual training to improve our awareness and, just improve overall options for movement when we do train. So when do we perform these CARs? The words of Dr. Spina, you do them every damn day. For 5 to 10 minutes, I don't think there's a better bang for your buck from, a self-assessment standpoint, or also an intervention standpoint from a mobility perspective. Okay. Those 5 to 10 minutes in a warm-up, as we like to do them in a warm-up, they give our athletes an opportunity to check in with how they're doing and how their joints are handling the training load. They give us as coaches valuable information. As an athlete can come to us and point to a specific range for a specific joint and say, hey, this is tight or this is sore. What do I do now? Rather than them just trying to go through the normal warm-up, start throwing a baseball, and all of a sudden come to you and be like, oh, my shoulder hurts a little bit. It gives us good information. So we do them every single day when athletes are in here, and we encourage them to do it every single day when they get up to just get their joints moving. Okay. So what do they look like? So we're going to go through a video of, a number of different positions for CARs for our hips, as well as how we would train to get more range, and then what we would do after the fact, okay? So you're going to see me here performing controlled articular rotations for my hip in a number of different positions. Again, the key component here is to isolate movement to the one hip, trying to get as much range as we can possibly get with rotation. So for the hip, there's a number of different ways that we can do this. When we have athletes come in and first learn the system, we expose them to a number of different ways to go through CARs, and we let them choose the one that they feel the most confident in that they can actually perform the protocol and not display changes on a day-to-day perspective. So if they feel hip CARs, maybe in a half kneeling position, that's the one that they're going to do consistently, and it'll keep them honest. We prefer using a pull because it constrains the rest of our body. But again, we're using this as an indicator of how we're doing day to day. Once we've identified, a specific range of motion that is may potentially in deficit relative to than it was the day before, or something that we may be wanting to improve in the off season, we have to apply some sort of protocol to improve that range. One of our main go-tos for that is, again, from the functional range systems world of pails and rails. We're essentially trying to contract into that stretch or into that end range with isometric contraction. So essentially, we're trying to find that range of motion where we're stuck or we're stiff or we can't get any further, and then we're going to try to impose a contraction into an immovable object, which is the pails, and then try to actively pull ourselves further into that range with the rails. So again, you can see there's a number of different positions in which I can try and isolate a specific range. There's no set protocols. It's not, this is how you stretch this muscle. It's really all about finding the range that is in deficit or stiff, and then contracting into that range to gain more range of motion. Now, once we have that range or we've improved it, we need to start using it. So these are just a few examples of how we would actually use that range of motion. As some ways in which we'll try to express not just an isometric and working at that end range, but we'll try and take that joint through a full range. So you can see me here just going through some basic movements. You can see how hard this is for me, but we're trying to just isolate range, specifically in rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, a little bit of flexion in these various positions where I'm trying to actively work into that range and get out of it. I'm not just passively hanging out. So there's a number of different ways in which we can do this. We can isolate specific joints first, which is the way that we like to do it. And then once we've specifically isolated that joint, we can actually integrate that with other joints. But again, it's all about being creative. And if you go to our Instagram page or our YouTube channel, there's a bunch of videos in which you can see more of this stuff if you're interested. But again, it's very specific to what that player is feeling on a day-to-day basis, and it's not do this stretch for this muscle, because everyone's a little bit different and they're going to feel tension and they're going to feel changes at different ranges, and we need to attack those specific ranges. Okay. So in summary, I think the big takeaway from this, hopefully, is that we should start thinking about recovering range of motion and trying to, measure it and improve it and address it on a day-to-day basis, especially when we're imposing a lot of demand on our athletes in the form of playing baseball. Okay, what we're trying to do, is prevent changes, large changes in organismic constraints so that we don't, ultimately change our movement pattern and maintain the same sort of throwing load, overall load, while potentially undergoing an acute change or an acute spike in specific load into our tissues. Okay, to me, joint recovery and looking at joint range of motion really is essential to individualization process. If you want specificity and you want individualization, I don't think you can look any further or any closer than just looking at the joint itself. So, I think that's a really important concept as well to keep in mind. For us, using CARS and using this process is a way of improving autonomy and self-discovery for the athlete. I think the more you look into the research and the more you try to understand, what we're trying to recover in the perceptual subjective side of things, one of the best ways to do that is to allow an athlete, some sort of autonomy and some sort of, their own direction in how they want to feel recovered. And for us, the self-discovery process of using CARS early on is a very good way and a very powerful way of doing that. Okay. Again, I don't need to necessarily harp on the daily assessment thing, but to me, it's very underrated. Once you've taught this well and you have your athletes perform it well, they become their own coaches in a way, and they become their own movement coaches, and they have a way of distinguishing pain versus stiffness, and have some sort of a methodology and protocol for addressing that, where you don't have to necessarily check in all the time. Even as a coach, as a therapist or a strength conditioning coach, you want to have more information and better information from your athletes. So if you're getting them to perform these CARS as a daily assessment tool, they can come to you with way better information, and they can help you direct wherever they need to go a lot faster. Okay. And finally, I think if you try to centralize and integrate these findings into an actually comprehensive system and an integrative system, between the coaches and the athletes and the strength conditioning coaches and the therapist, you're going to be way better off. If everyone's speaking the same language on this front and they all have access to this sort of information, it can be a lot easier to address and make changes, especially in season. So thank you again for listening. If you do have any questions or any comments, or you think I'm missing something, let me know. You can find all my contact information here. If you're interested in purchasing the Recovery for Baseball book, just head to our website and you'll find it pretty easily there as well. So thanks again for listening, and have a good day.